Hi, thank you so much for having me today. This is such a great discussion and event every summer. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to do, let's go ahead and do this. There we go. We're going to do, I know I only have about, 25 minutes or so. We're going to do a little bit on supporting our unaccompanied immigrant students. And in the short time that we have together today, I'm going to cover 5 key points. Okay. Some of them you may have seen in my blog article that was circulated or other presentations that I've done. So I hope this is helpful. So the first key point to know, and we've seen these children and youth on the border on the news, mostly from the Northern Triangle. We've got Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But our number one point is the time to prepare is now. And here is why. I want to tell you a little bit about the timeline involved for children that are crossing the border and then the system that they enter in. So when these children cross the border, they're typically apprehended by the Department of Homeland Security. And in the first 72 hours when they're in Department of Homeland Security custody, this is the images that we typically see on the news when we see kids with those blankets that look like aluminum foil. When we see the, quote unquote, kids in cages, we hear kids talking about how they were in a freezer. That's usually, they're referring to when they were in Department of Homeland Security custody. After the first 72 hours or within the first 72 hours, they are transferred to the care and custody of the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. And while they're in the Office of Refugee Resettlement custody, they're in completely different types of facilities than what they just came from. So let me actually share, I was going to share the PowerPoint with you all so that you can have, oh, you know what, I got to get that link to you. I'll get that to you right after. But so you have all the hyperlinks here because you can read more about the types of facilities that they're in. But for the most part, they're in facilities that are similar to shelters. Sometimes there are more group home type settings. Sometimes they're in, there are some that are more like a juvenile detention situation if the child has any kind of criminal background or admits that they're in a gang or things like that. But for the most part, they're in shelters. And you'll see I have on the graphic there that currently the average amount of time that they're in one of these Office of Refugee Resettlement facilities is about 35 days. Sometimes when there are many kids on the border, sometimes that average goes up, sometimes it goes down. And it really depends on the child's specific situation, because the whole purpose that they're in there is for caseworkers and social workers to use that time to track down their family members. So they're looking for a mom, a dad, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a former neighbor, someone in the United States who is able to take the child in. And as you can imagine, there needs to be at least a little bit of background checks and security concerns and that type of thing. So for a child who has a mom or a dad waiting for them, they may be out in a week or two because it's hopefully going to be a quicker paperwork process. But if it's, a former, cousin's neighbor who once met the child when they were 2 and they're now 15, it's going to be a much longer process to get them out of federal custody. Also, a very important point, probably the number one point for educators on this call today, is that these children are in deportation proceedings. So even though this one arm of the federal government is saying, okay, here you go, we release you to your mom or your aunt or your uncle or whoever, that is the Health and Human Services side of our government saying, this is we want you to be safe and secure while your immigration case is proceeding. And so these kids all need lawyers. They need immigration attorneys. This is not, hey, we're letting you out of custody. You're here to stay forever. This is, let me give you a date for your immigration court hearing. You need a lawyer. So that's a very, very, very brief overview of kind of the timeline of how this goes down. Again, I'll get you the slides in a little bit, and then you can read a little bit more about the facilities and the process for family reunification at the links there that I included in the pink and blue below. Okay, our second key point, and by the way, I see things coming in the chat box. We'll be discussing, I know, a little bit later after the second speaker. So I believe that will be the time for questions. Our second key point is that the Office of Refugee Resettlement's definition of unaccompanied minor is not the same as the definition that we use in education, which is the one that falls under the McKinney Vento Act. But there is overlap in the populations. So let me give you the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement definition, and then we'll do a little Venn diagram that shows the overlap. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement definition and Homeland Security, et cetera, you'll hear the term unaccompanied alien child. Not the friendliest of terms, but I'm letting you know what the federal government uses. So by their definition, we're looking at kids who have no lawful immigration status in the United States. They're not yet 18, and they are without a parent or legal guardian when they are apprehended at the border. Okay, so when they're apprehended at the border. I know sometimes when we see or hear about unaccompanied minors, we think that these kids are truly traveling on their own. That's not usually the case. They're usually with other kids. They may be with a cousin or an aunt, uncle. They may be with other people. It's just that when they're crossing the border, they're not with their parent or legal guardian, and therefore the federal government deems them as unaccompanied. Okay, so here is our overlap. So if we look at in the white, if you have a child or a student in school who was just considered unaccompanied by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, this would be a child who crosses the border, again, without their parent or guardian, but they get released to a parent in the United States. So then that child and their parent walk into your school system to enroll the student in school. You're not going to necessarily know any different. I mean, once you start asking questions, most of us will figure out pretty quickly that the student really doesn't know the parent doesn't know the child, but they're not likely going to be flagged in your system in any way, shape, or form. Versus the dark blue, if we have a child who is considered unaccompanied per McKinney Vento, this could be a child who crosses the border either with their parent or legal guardian, or maybe they were never apprehended by Homeland Security at all. And so they are never brought to the attention of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But then when they get to us, maybe they are living alone and they're renting a room, or they're with someone other than their parent or legal guardian, or they start sleeping on their friend's couch, or, you know, various situations where hopefully our system will properly recognize them as an unaccompanied youth per McKinney Vento and provide the appropriate supports. And then lastly, in the light blue, if they're both, you know, both categories of unaccompanied, this would be that child who crosses the border without their parent or guardian and gets released to someone who is not their parent or legal guardian. So that happens as well. All right. Moving along here, our third key point is that youth from Guatemala make up the largest percentage of unaccompanied minors. At this point, it's almost half, okay? And many of these youth have indigenous or Mayan roots. So here is a map of Guatemala. For many of you, this information is, you've known this for years. For others, this may be newish information. So in Guatemala, sometimes you'll hear, oh, the student speaks another dialect. Well, really what we're talking about here is 22 different Mayan nations. So it's not just languages. These are different cultures. We're talking about Native American populations. Technically, I've talked a lot about this with my colleagues at the International Mayan League. They're not Hispanic, they're not Latino, they're Native American. And so many don't speak Spanish. And looking back in kind of the history, when we look at the 36-year civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Guatemala, that war disproportionately affected the Mayan communities. And so they've got, for many generations, these levels of historical trauma and persecution. This is very, very important because what we see in a lot of large school districts is, we look at when we register, we look at the home language surveys, or we look at our central databases, and we see lots of students from Guatemala, but a lot of times we just see Spanish listed, or we see students labeled as Hispanic or Latino. And the thing is that these communities, they have a history of surviving by hiding their identities. And this plays a very key role when they're registering. If you, depending on how your forms are, if you have, Mom and Quiche and some of the other languages listed, okay, that's a little more, I don't know, I guess easier to share that information. Or if I know whenever I work with Guatemalan families, I say, oh, habla otro idioma? Do you speak another language? Oh yeah, I speak Mom. Or my grandma spoke Mom, but I don't really speak it anymore. Things like that can help, make families comfortable to share that information. And then lastly, I know a lot of times when we talk about why unaccompanied minors are coming, you'll see, lists of push and pull factors. We'll talk a lot about violence, gangs, and poverty, various reasons, right? But another one that I wanted to highlight here that's really key for the Mayan communities is that there are lots of conflicts over the land going on and natural resources. And according to my colleagues at the International Mayan League, this is one of the main reasons that a lot of the indigenous youth and families are leaving Guatemala, is if they no longer, if their farmland has been destroyed, or they no longer have access to clean water, those types of things. It's really affecting their livelihoods. Okay, and let's see, number 4, moving along. I know we don't have a long time together, so I'll keep it moving, and then I know we'll do our questions later. Number 4, and this is where I'll get a little bit into the mental health piece, but I'm also saving a lot of that for my colleague that's coming after me, because the folks at Boston, they're going to talk about their immigrant and refugee core stressors toolkit, and that is very much the model that we at Immigrant Connections support and we utilize in all of our trainings. So I don't want to duplicate too much what they're doing. But number 4 here is that teachers, not just our school counselors, not just our school psychologists or social workers, et cetera, play an incredibly important role in the mental health and social emotional support of unaccompanied minors. And again, I think my colleague will talk about this somewhat in the next session, but here's a piece that I wanted to highlight for all of you. In public health, social work, other various fields, we talk a fair amount about risk and protective factors, okay? And some of you may be familiar with this concept, some of you may not be. But so when we talk about risk factors, we're basically looking at conditions or attributes of individuals or families, communities, et cetera, that are associated with a higher likelihood of negative outcomes. So if you have a child who is separated from their mom, who has witnessed violence, all those kinds of things. I'm sure you all have a good sense of, we talk about children at risk, right? But protective factors, this is the part that educators, I feel like, don't talk a lot about. Protective factors are the conditions and the attributes of individuals, families, communities, et cetera, that mitigate or eliminate risk. Okay, so you look at the scale there that we're in the image, and if we've got protective factors that kind of win out in this balancing act, you've got a resilient child. If the risk factors win out, you've got a pretty vulnerable child. So the protective factors are what we want to beef up, right? This is what we want to increase. And so if we look at, in this study that I've highlighted on the left, the most evidence-based protective factors when we're looking at immigrant and refugee children and adolescents are these 4 things. And you can see the first 2 right off the bat are very connected to what happens in the classroom: school connectedness and peer support. Okay, so school connectedness, what kinds of things can we do in our classrooms? What kind of things are we already doing in our classrooms that we can continue or maintain? to help students feel like they belong, that they have friends, they're connected to that school community, that classroom community, etc. And then peer support. I've been doing lots of trainings on this topic for school districts around the country and have been pleasantly surprised, not surprised, but happy to hear about a number of schools that have peer mentoring programs, whether kind of formal or informal, but even that kind of like buddy system, if you have a newcomer and you connect them with someone who's been here a little longer, who speaks the same language, that peer connection, peer support, right? The third one on here is integrative acculturation style. And without getting into kind of all the different types of acculturation styles, what I will say about what they mean here by integrative acculturation style is basically helping our students become bicultural. So we talk a lot in education about bilingualism, but I feel like a lot of times we kind of forget the piece about biculturalism. And so this idea is that students, children, studies have shown that children do best when they essentially are kind of taking the best of both worlds, taking the best of both cultures. It's not, one end over here, kind of out with the old, in with the new. I want to be quote unquote Americanized, or I want to do this or that. And it's not the other polar opposite of, I don't want to adapt any of that. I just, I'm Honduran, I'm Salvadoran, and that's what I'm doing. It's a little bit of adapting and kind of taking the best of both worlds. And then the last one is family cohesion. And this ties very much into family engagement. Some of you who kind of know Immigrant Connections and know our work, we do a lot on family and community engagement in schools. And so in this case, in the context of unaccompanied minors, whether it's mom, dad, aunt, uncle, whoever that caregiver or sponsor was that the child was released to, making sure that they're in the loop, right? Making sure they're in the loop and learn a little bit about, how we do school here, help orient them, help make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page. And then number 5. So number 5, this is an interesting one that I think this is another area I've been working on a lot in recent months, because this is one of those major disconnects, I think, between education and this other system that I'm talking about that serves these children. So some of these students are going to receive what's called post-release services, and it's important to partner with these providers. So what I mean by this is these post-release services are essentially, unfortunately, they're not for all kids coming out of federal custody. These services are, think of it as sort of case management or like a social worker who follows the child, okay? But these services, unfortunately, are only for about 25 to 30% of the kids coming out of federal custody. These are kids that have some sort of red flag, right? Is there a concern that there's some trafficking going on? Are we releasing what they call a tender age child that's under 12? Is this, we're releasing a 13-year-old girl to an unrelated male adult? Okay, red flags. There's a number of red flags that the federal government recognizes and says, we need to provide these post-release services. These services, which involve, home visits, helping to connect the child and their sponsor with community resources, also helping to enroll them in school if there's any problems. I know one district I was working with recently said, yeah, we got this email from this lady who was suddenly saying that she had these kids and she was advocating for them to get enrolled. We don't know who she was. And I was like, oh, I bet that was the post-release service provider. And she's like, what's that? And so I had to kind of put everything together for them to help them understand. So here are the main agencies that provide post-release services, okay? The Catholics and their network is huge. The Lutherans and their network is huge. There's a group called U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. They have a whole network. BCFS, I don't know what that stands for. I think they stopped using whatever their original thing was and they only use the acronym. There's Bethany Christian Services and Southwest Keys. There's a couple other players. So here's what you're going to do, though. Because I guarantee you, if you say to your student, are you receiving post-release services? They're not gonna know what you're talking about. So what you wanna ask them, and this is why, you wanna think about avoiding duplication of services. So if you have a student who walks in and who is, wearing clothes that don't really fit, they're hungry all the time, they're getting in conflicts with their, aunt that they've been placed with or what have you, you want to find out if this magical case manager or social worker is already working with them so that you can partner with them and not duplicate services. So what you might try asking is, is there any type of social worker helping you right now? Like, what are they helping you with? Do you know their name and number? Sometimes people will produce a business card, like especially not maybe the student, but the parent or caregiver. Oh, this lady right here? Yes, that's the lady I'm looking for, And so if you have paperwork to share information, like a release, a confidentiality type thing, sign the paperwork and make sure it's okay with the family that you collaborate and, share information and collaborate on services. Unfortunately, there is no overall database of providers. It's annoying. There are a lot of us advocates who are pushing for this. Some people say, well, there's a trafficking risk. We can't publish that. But you can basically, you're going to Google, you're going to talk to any refugee resettlement providers in your area and say, hey, are you guys also providing post-release services? And then when I get you the PowerPoint, you can click on some of these links. So a couple of these do have links to Google Docs that they have been willing to share their networks, and you can take a look at those. Okay, last thing I want to say in my final minute is this topic is very complex. There's no way I could do it justice in like 20 minutes. So if you would like more information on this topic and this is all perhaps new to you, or you just want to learn more, we do synchronous and asynchronous workshops on this topic. So the synchronous ones coming up are July 20th and 27th. We did a morning one and an afternoon one so that we're on the East Coast, but help out the West Coast folks. And then here's the asynchronous option that we do in collaboration with English Learner Portal. The next section, if you're just like an individual that wants to sign up, is September 20th. But if you are a administrator or someone who has a group of people, we can start your group basically anytime. So you can get in touch with me. So that, in a very quick nutshell, is there's my contact information, and I am going to stop sharing my screen so I can get you all the link to the PowerPoint before I forget about that. Grab that.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation. And I do want to emphasize one point. First of all, I apologize. I gave you the wrong title for your presentation. That's coming up right now. You were talking about unaccompanied minors, but so much of what you said can be applied to the adult ed setting in terms of better supporting and better integrating adult students. So I really hope everyone got that.
Can I say one piece about that? I was thinking about that when I saw the statistics of how many adult ed folks were going to be on today. Very important, because in many cases, your students are going to be the one receiving unaccompanied minors. They may come to you and say, oh, my nephew just arrived at the border. I need to fill out this packet that I got from the government. Can you help me? Or can you help me understand what this packet is? So if that hasn't happened to you before, that may happen to you. There's lots of overlap in these topics.